Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards, and this is going to be a quick one. Just really the tip of a concept here. It's kind of going to be like the concrete universal from last episode, but even more simple, even more straightforward. Yeah, right. Anyway, not only can I not do a short episode, but I don't think I can keep anything simple. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. So today we're going to be looking at some ideas I've been pondering over the last couple weeks, which lead up to and derive from Slavoj Zizek's use of the parallax as a subjective positioning framework. So, in the scope of this podcast, this concept helps us to undermine the binary and oppositional ideas we've been discussing so far, while also preparing us for future dives into alchemy and vitalism, which are, of course, also these weird ideas of positioning and sort of maybe even losing your way. So, I also still owe you one on how architecture provokes terrorism, which also requires some fancy repositioning, so this should help. But that's all in the future. Today, we're going to be talking about psychology, religion, and some other things. Also, we can map out how we position ourselves in and through society through things like ego and desire. Now, this is all going to lead us into the next episode, and that's really about the parallax view, which is a means to find a position by establishing points of reference. Now, from these points of reference, we can triangulate and figure out where we're sitting, standing, how we're behaving. But the really novel aspect of Zizek's idea of the parallax view, how he uses it, is to become aware that this focal point, the thing that we fixate on that's in the center, it shifts in position as the point of view shifts. Yeah, we'll get into more of that later. But the idea there is that your marker by which you navigate and determine yourself, that is really your perspective that allows you to position yourself. Yeah, well, its fixity is subjectively dubious. Part 1. Precursor. Now, as a contextual precursor, I'm going to map out a little bit of a quandary, a conundrum if you will, which has multiple proposed solutions for the same problem. Now, we're all familiar with this kind of thing, but my reasoning for this episode is to walk through a problem of perspectives around the same problem. And that's really before we define the parallax once again next episode. Now, the grand cultural context we're in, our background to all of our arguments today, can arguably be post-structuralist or deconstructionist, right? That is a kind of theory where our brains are trained to be creatively destructive. So we're always seeking chinks. We're pouring ourselves into these chinks and we're expanding. We're creating widening gaps. And this causes cracks to break the hegemonic narrative. Now, this clever prerogative, it's really built out to us as liberation from lies and authority. And really what happens is we're looking to break power. And in so breaking it, we actually gain a semblance of righteous power as the liberator. We are the clever breaker. The professed ultimate goal of this breaking, deconstruction, is to limit exploitation and abuse, which should actually end up empowering the individuals, right? And overall, this shattering should provide us with the stability of flattened equality. So this is kind of like creating a gravel pit where once there was a castle. But when we think about this, yeah, our reality, well, our outcome here doesn't seem to line up with the way that all this was pitched. So in philosophy, one way to consider our ideological ontology is Hegel's notion of negation. Now, this is not necessarily the negative, but it is our ability to negate the impact or power of something, right? This is to nullify it or to cancel it. While Hegel makes his point, oddly enough, it preserves the positions that we just canceled. So our liberation is by canceling. But we must retain the position that we canceled, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything to fight in the future. And who are we, if not people who are fighting against things, right? Like we don't even know who we are unless we know who our enemies are. Oh, but that sounds weird, right? That sounds a little bit odd. Now, what this exemplifies is that we have to have some sort of self-narrative as humans. And that also means we need to have some sort of eventual goal in order to position ourselves in society, which is really how we know who we are. So we look outwards to society to mirror our position back to us. So this is once again all about perspective and framing and positioning. So given this awkward idea of negation that includes the preservation of what we just negated, well, our negation informs our status, that is ourselves. So we have moved fully into a time of continuous reframing, repositioning, rather than a stable tradition. And this is because we've broken the stable traditions. In our attempt to liberate ourselves, to be free, we have made a world of ever more positions, right? Every cancellation is a new position. So we've just made more gravel. So we not only have the positions we supposedly overcame, right, which are now below us in theory, and although canceled and supposedly non-relevant, they still remain as this fractured rubble. But each of these positions we take to negate is itself negated from a new position. So our negations are then negated, adding to the rubble pile. Now, the worry is, besides all points getting lost as the gravel multiplies, is that gravel, in general, can be a slippery surface to get traction on. Hence, one of the things we're witnessing right now is this retro-nostalgic turn. And this is people attempting to return to the past, to rebuild some sort of foundation. And the glue, that is the mortar that they are using, is traditionalism. As in, we know it was bad, but it can't be any worse and more precarious than it is now. Yeah, so let's take a look at this. Matthew Crawford and others actually say that all this started maybe 100 years ago. And that was to avoid the totalitarian narrative, the nationalistic, fascistic sort of mindset that was sweeping through Europe. So modernist thinkers, they said, you know what? We need to break traditional beliefs, like the authority of the father, like things like social norms, religious zealous belief, major institutions. And in doing so, in breaking these, we are left relying now on alternate ways of framing the world, which are becoming increasingly complex and incommensurate. Now, this is all just the background. This is all just where we're existing right now. This is the background of our perspective when we're looking outwards. When we look to the hills, they have been flattened. The trees have been harvested or they're on fire. And I think there are a couple of dispositions here in the rubble. And that is people wanting to build something, right? Craving stability and willing to submit to authority despite its historic dangers. And then we also have this counterpoint, which is to sort of panpsychically elevate every single atom as somehow unique and having its own consciousness. So those are two extremes. But there's also this unfortunate side effect, which is that there's some rubble that has just given up. It's been just far too broken. It's just going to continue taking soma, playing video games, and waiting to upload their consciousness and just fade out. Because really, the other two options, building something or panpsychism, yeah, they just seem insane. Part 2. A shrink, a monk, and a priest walk into a bar. Okay, great summary, Ryder. This is really cheerful. Yeah, whatever. Okay, so on our perspectival journey here, let's walk through something I've been pondering lately, which are methods of reframing our lives. And this is choosing a new perspective because we're actually, as a society, more unhappy, anxious, and despairing than we were in the past, according to the studies. Now, we can consider that either we are, one, caught up in a deforming, brutal system that preys on our mental health, or two, we're delusional to think that the world would ever be nice. Now, a third option here brought up by a friend of mine said that maybe we're, pragmatic rationalists. Maybe there's a group of us out there. And I might actually claim that all of us want to think we are, but we aren't. And so that's an episode for another day. So let's stick with our first two positions. So while I hope that really it is number one, that is a disfiguring pressure upon us, it is probably a combo, right? In that we have also lost the idea that reality is hard and happiness is fleeting. and maybe not a pursuit that we should be actively involved in. So what we're instead offered today is things like therapy, meditation, and religion. Now, these are tools to alter our subjective framing. These are tools for relief from the society that we live in and what we feel we deserve. And these tools help pull us out of our instant reactions to reposition us with a different perspective. Now, this is the equivalent to walking with your head down, not to trip, right? Because you're scared and nothing's working out for you, and whoa, and then suddenly you're able to look up and look around. You're able to see the horizon instead of your portending doom. That's what these tools do. Psychology, analysis, and therapy. So, a psychologist, or maybe an analyst, they walk into a bar, and they blame their parents. Now, today, we have psychotherapy. We also have something called cognitive behavioral therapy. This helps us self-soothe by reframing, by moving past the initial fear, rage, anxiety reaction to a broader, more moderate position. Arguably, psychoanalysis does the same thing. Now, in therapy, you recognize your trauma, maybe from your origin or from sort of some previously unexamined point in your past. And once enlightened to it and its effect on your original position, its reaction can be mollified. Now, this doesn't mean in any way that you won't have another reaction and it won't come from either the same or some other point, but the idea is that you can sort of move around it and react differently once you're aware of it. Now, there's an interesting aside here, and this is from Zizek. Lacanian psychoanalysis is actually more about hysterisizing the psychotic subject. Oh, that's crazy, right? So what happens is the psychotic has found their desired path, and the analyst forces a rupture, that is a schism, to move them beyond a single point of fixation, which implies really to be normalized, to be non-psychotic, is either to have multiple points of fixation, or more accurately, to never know exactly who you are. Why am I who you say I am? This really is the normal position from which you rely on society. So the danger here is to know precisely who you are and what you desire. That might be considered psychotic. Haha. So anyway, that's the end of the aside. Now let's get back to our repositioning tools and perspective. Buddhism. A monk walks into a bar and never gets around to ordering a drink. So reframing in the context of meditation, this really attempts to center us in the present, be here now, as Ram Dass would say, which dismisses past rumination and future worry. Now, this draws a lot from Buddhism, which is to say, desire causes worry and fear. To regret the past and attempt to make up for it, or to worry about the future and assume you can control anything, yeah, that's your ego assuming it can somehow change or affect the world and somehow save you from something. By dissolving the ego, you get to release fear and pride, which are motivational drivers. And suddenly, interestingly, no one can control you because you're not motivated by their motivations. So, disillusion of the ego means it's hard for society to position you when you no longer really have this ego handle that they can grab onto and jerk you around with. So the ego in this sense is a positioning element. It lets you know where you are in relation to society. The ego really is a scorekeeper and a status machine. It's obsessed with where you fit in. So when we're talking about positioning and perspectival stuff, the ego is key. But now, in a bit of a leap here, if you completely lose your ego, well then don't you lose the sort of Lacanian conception of you, who you are. Now, simplifying Lacan, how you become an individual subject, a unique individual, well, that's how you become you. This is precisely through pursuing the object of your desire. And without desire, without ego, who are you? So, CBT, therapy, and meditation, all of these help you reframe how you fit into the world, how you see your position in the world. It allows you to prioritize your desires differently. Now, this, in our analogy from earlier, is if you're heading towards that castle, you're slogging uphill, these techniques, they ask you to stop and smell the roses, or maybe realize that you're next to a beautiful lake. And perhaps you could just, while you're at it, just take your foot off the neck of that goose you just furiously trampled in your headlong rush. Now, Buddhism is ridding yourself of even attempting to desire anything at all. So, I'm going to circle through this one more time, but if you remove the object at the center of desire, be it status or a sexy partner, or maybe for me, a really nice coffee machine or a really great table saw, that thing it would make me complete as a person, and I really need it. And well, what happens if I lose that object? Well, you lose the self in terms of location. That is, we've lost the markers of our positioning. It's almost as if we were heading to that castle and suddenly a fog descended upon us. And then we're left lost and wandering. And you just have to choose to be okay with that. Christianity. A priest walks into a bar, and he promptly turns around and leaves. Okay, so perhaps you're thinking, well, I'm not a Buddhist and I don't believe in therapy. Well, perhaps you're actually a Christian here, right? And maybe you're getting all you need from your religion, and you can think, thank God, I'm never lost. Yeah, yes, of course, you've got this excellent North Star. It's not a castle that someone else built that you're chasing here. But the question for this exercise is, are you a self without desire? So let's walk through this conundrum again, because it still exists between how you are a self and how we react to and through desire, how it motivates us, and how this makes us an individual. So let's consider most of our desires as profane and fleshy sinful temptations. So to sin really is from the Greek hamartia, or from the Hebrew hata, which translates as to miss the mark. To sin is to position yourself further away from God. That is the ideal. That is the center. This is how you measure yourself. So when you sin, that's actually how you know where you are. Now, in Christian theology, the split between the soul and body attributes most of your sinful desires to the flesh, not to the spirit. Your animal body is tempted into sloth, sex, gluttony, greed, etc., and you must overcome this animal spirit. Interestingly, you're allowed desire, that is, your desire to align with God, to grow nearer the object of desire. So what happens in Christianity is you attempt to close the gap, reducing sin by desiring proximity to the one. Now, this desire, like any sort of modeled mimetic desires we've talked about, is not for unique individuality. That's not the point of it. But instead, it's to be utterly consumed into God. The absolute Christian loses their subjectification. They enter the radiant hive mind. They're washed clean and they're pure. They're perfectly aligned with the center of their world. Now, if you capture your desire and you, as an individual, cease to exist, you are at this point completely aligned, completely subjugated, and subsumed. Now, in this way, Christianity uses your desire rather than negating it. It uses your desire, and this desire, once fulfilled, it leads you to no longer desire. Unfortunately, what we encounter more often is this non-perfect state, which is a failure to close the gap completely. The desire to sin remains because, of course, we're trapped in the flesh, the animal, and the act of repressing these bodily desires becomes who you are. It becomes the self. That is, the discipline of profane desire for a spiritual desire becomes who you are. Now, this allows proximity to God, but never sublimation, until, unfortunately, you have to be liberated from this lousy flesh sack that God somehow trapped you in. Part 3, Summary and Perspective into Parallax. So, yeah, this all might seem convoluted and leaning a bit sideways right now because I've just mapped out a meandering path. By the way, this just happens to me when I get into religion and psychology. I get really dizzy. But anyway, the point is that little walk of ours through the conundrum of the desiring self and the methods of reframing it and positioning it is really to walk you through some of the contradictions that plague us. They appear irreconcilable, even given a whole number of different solutions and positions. So now we have to ask if the framing positions in, say, psychoanalysis or therapy from Lacan, Christianity, or Buddhism and meditation, if any of this changes the problem itself, or it has merely changed our subjective position. That is, Are we just ameliorating the symptoms here and we're not actually going for the cure? I mean, does this thing just reframe our perspective on the same problem without fixing anything? Now, the answer from Zizek is, of course, yes and no. Of course, right? Now, the problem that he shows us, which we're going to get into next episode, is that our focal point, that is maybe this desiring self, and we're moving around through Christianity, Buddhism, or therapy around the fringes to look at it. Yeah, well, there's also a background behind that. And that was this background I pointed out earlier, where we took this castle and we've reduced it to rubble. So what happens, though, is that our focal point, this center point, actively shifts. That is, it sort of shifts sideways as we take on a new vantage point. It actually is slippery. Now, what Zizek suggests is instead of the negation, that is the deconstructivist rubble that we talked about earlier, yeah, it has created an apocalyptic landscape for us, but there might actually be a solution that's apparent here, and it isn't just creating more positions. This kind of rubble, it might actually have its own solution inside of it. That is, imminent to the problem is the solution. All right, thank you for tuning in. If you can't tell, this episode is a broad context for some trickier concepts coming up next. I've said that like 6 times. I hope you get it. But we're just laying groundwork, and I hope that this allows us to appreciate Zizek's attempt to solve it. But as always, if you enjoyed the episode, please like, rate, review, and it's always best if you can share the podcast with a friend. So I have given up on monetizing this hobby for right now, so the only payback I'm really getting is knowing if you like this thing. Really, I also do get this side little benefit of acting smart at dinner parties until everyone goes glassy-eyed. So now people invite me over because I'm really just a great antidote to insomnia. So once again, thanks for your time. This is Ryder Richards. Stay safe and be dangerous.